Good afternoon, chaps, and welcome to this week's Dictators v Democrats weekly roundup, where you get the quick-fire news of what's been happening in the struggle to defend democracy globally. This week we have Russia stumbling in Sumy, we have protests in Serbia, continued protests in Togo, and one of the last bastions of Hong Kong democracy falls. First to the Ukrainian front and Russia's much awaited summer offensives. Well, they've started with an offensive in the Sumy direction to push Ukrainian forces away from Russia's Kursk Oblast, where they faced an embarrassing incursion into Russian territory over a number of months, which was eventually mostly pushed out by a large Russian counteroffensive. Well, they're aiming to continue that offensive into Sumy. And at the 2025 St. Petersburg Economic Forum, Russian dictator Vladimir Putin floated the concept of taking the entire city of Sumy. Well, that fantasy has gone straight into Ukrainian reality, or straight into swarms of FPV drones. Head of the Ukrainian army, General Alexander Sursky, said when he was speaking to troops in Sumy that based on the results of May and June, we can say that this year's wave of the enemy's summer offensive from Russian territory is faltering. Not only has the attack, which started in May and has occupied around 449 square kilometers of the territory, which is the most in 2025 so far, cost around 1,000 Russian soldiers' lives every day, that is across the entire front, faltered. It is now being pushed back. General Sursky added that in certain areas, Ukrainian troops are already liberating areas that were taken by the Russians. Russia has been forced to put some of its more elite units, that's Marines and VDV, onto defensive postures in Sumy because of this. These units are storm units. They should be being used to assault Ukrainian positions, and they are not. In the Kursk and Slobodansky directions, they've pinned around 50,000 Russian soldiers down. However, this is not likely to be the end of Russia's summer offensives, and Sursky added that around 110,000 Russian soldiers have gathered around the city of Pokrovsk, which is a small city, a pre-war population of about 60,000, but does sit at an important confluence of road and railway networks in eastern Ukraine, which connects it with Konstantinivka, Kramatorsk and Slovyansk. Now, although Pokrovsk is, of course, important, Sursky noted that the main goal is not military. He said they want to do this not only to achieve some operational results, but primarily for demonstrative purposes, to achieve a psychological effect, to put the infamous foot of the Russian soldier there, plant a flag and trumpet another pseudo-victory. That foot of the Russian soldier he's talking about refers to a comment from Vladimir Putin at the St. Petersburg Economic Forum, where he said, wherever a Russian soldier steps, that territory is ours. Now, as soon as he said that, President Zelensky reminded the rest of the democratic world that he means wherever they have ever stood. So he means Belarus, he means the Baltic states, he means Moldova, Caucasus, and countries like Kazakhstan, any corner of the world, up to and including Germany. It must be remembered by all Democrats and all people of the free world that Ukraine is fighting for all of our liberties, and we should give them all the support that we are able. Now on to the Serbian front, where President Alexander Vucic is facing increasing protests. Now, there have been protests in Serbia since November of last year, after the Novi Sad railway tragedy in which 16 people were killed after the roof of a recently renovated railway collapsed. There were allegations of corruption, there were allegations of shoddy workmanship, and protests which were started by students have really not stopped. Those who may want to have a bit more of an in-depth about this, I recommend you go to Dictators v Democrats Why We Fight, my podcast series, and listen to episode 2 with Tamara. She goes into significant detail about the root causes behind the protests in Serbia and what Serbian protesters want. Although the latter, what they want, has now shifted. They've moved from wanting reform, wanting to deal with corruption in the Serbian government, to now calling, and this is a quote, "We want elections." Now, there were around 140,000 protesters in Belgrade on Saturday. Vucic responded on Instagram saying they want to topple Serbia and they have failed. It's not Serbia they want to topple. These people are mostly patriots. They want to topple Vucic. Vucic is making the old dictators, well, he's not quite a dictator, the old authoritarian populist mistake of equating the country with himself. He sees Serbia as not being Serbia if Vucic is not in charge. This is, of course, patently ridiculous. Young Serbia is growing, it is coming into itself, and it's realizing that it doesn't want to live in a Russian-style oligarchical kleptocracy. It wants to live in a democracy, with elections, with the rule of law, where you don't have to be a member of a political party to become a teacher, for God's sake. So, the protesters are saying, and what they said at the end of the protest was to take freedom into your own hands. And exactly. Freedom is not something that is given. It is only something that can be taken, and is something that has to be worked on constantly. They added later on Instagram that the authorities had all of the mechanisms and time to meet the demands and prevent an escalation. Instead, they opted for violence and repression against the people, and any radicalization of the situation is their responsibility. They've now moved from demanding reform to demanding a form of revolution, and we should support them in that. It must be remembered, of course, that Serbia is an important island of instability for Vladimir Putin. It's a button he can press to make Europe worried about another conflagration in the Balkans, and Vucic has helped him in that regard. He's moved tanks to the borders with Kosovo before, and he has increased his rhetoric. Serbia has yet to recognize Kosovo as an independent country. If that is taken away, then a weapon is taken out of Putin's arsenal, and Europe is able to concentrate much more on tackling Putin directly in Ukraine. And now we have to move on to a defeat, an absolute defeat for democracy. Hong Kong is a cautionary tale for anybody who is wanting to deal with the Chinese Communist Party and anybody who is a Democrat. It saddens me to report that one of the bastions of Hong Kong democracy, civil society and human rights has been forced on Sunday to disband. The League of Social Democrats was a party that organised enormous grassroots protest and enormous activism against the Chinese Communist Party's increasingly authoritarian rule of the territory. In their disbanding on Sunday, they had the Chinese characters for the word freedom plastered behind them on court summons documents. And the chairman of the party, Chan Po-ying, said the red lines are now everywhere. Our decision to disband was because we were facing a lot of pressure. And those red lines are coming from the Chinese Communist Party, and they are saying, well, you can't do this, you can't do that, you can't protest here, you can't mention things like Tiananmen Square, you can't call for democracy, etc. 3 opposition parties have disbanded so far this year alone in Hong Kong. And the party said in a statement, over these 19 years we have endured hardships of internal disputes and the near total imprisonment of our leadership, while witnessing the erosion of civil society, the fading of grassroots voices, the omnipresence of red lines, and the draconian suppression of dissent. Well, that draconian suppression of dissent has continued and has grown, especially since the national security laws and the enormous protests that followed, which were eventually put down by a devil's deal between Hong Kong police, the Chinese Communist Party, and local organised crime groups, the Triads. Now in June, the CCP director of Hong Kong and Macau Affairs Office, Xiao Baolong, said, "We must clearly see that the anti-China and Hong Kong chaos elements are still ruthless and are renewing various forms of soft resistance." Well, that soft resistance can be something as simple as saying, I disagree. I do not believe the country should be run in this manner. I want to celebrate or commemorate events of a certain date. I want to be slightly different. I want to have a voice. To a man like him, that is resistance. Resistance to what? Well, resistance to him and his allies. Resistance to their rule, resistance to their kleptocracy and to their absolute power. Because the Chinese Communist Party view people as objects to be used, as Körper, not the Leib, not the human being that grows and that can live and love and that can experience empathy for. This is why the Chinese Communist Party is able to engage in such repressions that we see in Hong Kong and that we see against the Uyghurs and that we see against many others, and that we certainly would see if the Chinese Communist Party were able to ever violently take over and annex the country of Taiwan. As for the future, well, as for Hong Kong, it is certain that further repression will continue and many people will have to leave. Vice Chairman of the League of Social Democrats, he said, Chow went on to add, the future is very difficult as a citizen. If you want to exercise your right as a citizen, it is very difficult, not only for the politician or the activist, when ordinary people need to think twice. Now, I expect that many Hong Kong pro-democracy activists will have now to leave the country and set up diaspora resistance in other places. The UK has opened the borders for them, and the United States is another option. Unfortunately, they will not be safe from the reach of the Chinese Communist Party there, as we see increased transnational repression in the democracies. This is something we really need to combat. We cannot allow these fake Chinese police stations to be set up, and we especially in the UK cannot allow the enormous embassy that they wish to build in Tower Hamlets. That would simply be used as a base to repress not only democracy and freedom-loving activists from the Chinese diaspora here in the UK, but likely also British citizens who wish to speak out for their brothers and sisters in China. Finally, onto the Togolese front, civil rights groups are saying that at least 7 people have been killed in protests calling for Togo's leader, Faure Gnassingbe, to step down and release political prisoners. Gnassingbe has been president now for 2 decades, and his family have ruled for around 58 years. He was recently sworn in as President of the Council of Ministers, a title and office which has no term limits as far as anybody can see, and protests have been banned in the country since 2022 for, quote, security reasons. A coalition of Togolese civil rights groups known as the National Platform for Civil Space and Development Effectiveness has called on the authorities to carry out an investigation into the police's response to the protests. The police, of course, used significant violence, tear gas, rubber bullets, etc. They condemned, quote, the use of disproportionate force against peaceful demonstrators, adding, peaceful protest is a fundamental right recognised both by the Togolese constitution and by international instruments ratified by our country. On to Terra Firma, I can report some good news. London's High Court has ruled that the oil giant Shell can be held legally responsible for pollution and environmental ruin from past oil leaks in Nigeria, including those caused by oil theft, a practice known as bunkering, and oil refining. The communities, the towns of Bile and Ogale, which have a population of around 50,000 together, have been left without clean water, unable to fish or farm, and suffering from chronic health issues due to repeated oil spills on their land. Now, after a 4-week trial that ran from February to March, the judge, Mrs. Justice May, ruled on Friday, the 20th of June, that Shell's attempts to restrict the full trial, due in 2027, have failed. Shell had argued for a 5-year limitation period, even in cases where the wealthy oil giant had failed to clean up the pollution. And Justice May found that any failure to clean up a spill could be an ongoing breach of Shell's legal obligations to do so and result in new cases. She also considered that an oil spill encroaching onto a person's land could be considered a trespass. Justice May found that oil pollution could also be considered a breach of the Nigerian constitution and the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, finding that knowledge about the impact of environmental harm has moved on such that there is now greater readiness to see polluting activities as capable of engaging the right to life, which is of course in the UN Charter as well. Now, the leader of the Ogale community said, "It's been 10 years now since we started this case. We hope that now Shell will stop these shenanigans and sit down with us to sort this thing out. People in Ogale are dying. Shell needs to bring a remedy. We thank the judicial system of the UK for this judgment." Now, the trial is set for 2027, and it really would be quite simple for Shell, a multinational worth billions, to clean up some oil spills in Nigeria. However, they do not want to. I can only guess as to why. Perhaps it would set a precedent. Perhaps it would simply cut into the profit margins. Either way, they clearly see the people of Ogale as perhaps disposable, perhaps people who don't really matter. I am glad that our justice system, that the justice system in the UK, has gone a step further towards bringing them justice and to ensuring that this environmental ruin does not go unpunished or unrepaired. On to other fronts. On the Hungarian front, attempts to ban the Pride Parade in Budapest failed massively. 200,000 people turned out for Pride in the face of threats from Orban's government, threats of fines and threats of imprisonment for organisers. It is a clear message to the government of Hungary and to Viktor Orban specifically that his people don't seem to want to follow him down the route into kleptocratic oligarchy and into Russia's sphere, that they want to remain a free, open society. Let's hope he listens, although I doubt he will. And that has been this week's Dictators v Democrats weekly roundup. I hope you found it vaguely informative. If you enjoyed it, please do like and subscribe. There is, of course, the Substack where I release longer form work, and the podcast Dictators v Democrats, Why We Fight, released every Friday. Terra Firma, my work on the climate crisis and how democracy can help us fight it, is released every Saturday. My paid subscribers get early access to both Terra Firma articles and the podcast Why We Fight. If you do consider supporting me, then I would be extremely grateful. If you have any questions, comments, concerns or critiques, please do let me know in the comments below. And remember, democracy is non-negotiable. Thank you very much, and I'll see you next week.